October 1944, Belfort, France. The chill of autumn hung heavy in the air as Georges Blind, a firefighter turned resistance fighter, stood against a cold stone wall. Before him, a German firing squad leveled their rifles, each barrel glinting in the pale morning light. The order was moments away. The soldiers waited. Silence fell. And then Georges smiled. No fear, no trembling. Just that faint, unshakable grin. It was an image so striking that even the German soldiers hesitated. Who was this man who could smile in the face of death? What could possibly drive a human being to defy the inevitability of a bullet, with nothing but courage and calm? What makes a man smile at death? Just days before, Georges had been captured by German forces for his work in the French resistance. He had helped smuggle messages, sabotage enemy supplies, and shield the identities of countless comrades. But now the Gestapo wanted names of those who fought beside him. They tried interrogation, torture, threats, yet Georges said nothing. His silence became their frustration, his resolve their failure. So they decided to stage a cruel spectacle, a mock execution meant to terrify him into submission. They tied him to a wall, raised their rifles, and prepared to break his will once and for all. But Georges did something no one expected. He didn't cry out. He didn't beg. He simply smiled. That moment, captured forever in a single haunting photograph, would become one of the most enduring symbols of resistance in World War II. A man staring, death in the face and refusing to give it power. This is the story of Georges Blind, the man who turned defiance into a weapon, whose courage outlasted his captors, and whose final smile became a message to the world. You may take my life, but never my spirit. Before the war, Georges Blind was known simply as a firefighter in the quiet city of Belfort, France, a man devoted to helping others. He wasn't born a soldier or a spy. He was a man who believed in service, in courage, in the duty to protect. But when war came to France in 1940, everything changed. The occupation was swift and brutal. The tricolor flag was replaced by the swastika, and the sound of boots echoed in the streets. For many, survival meant silence. For Georges, silence meant complicity. He could not stand by and watch his homeland bend under tyranny. He traded his fireman's uniform for the shadows of the French resistance, a network of ordinary men and women who risked everything to defy the German occupation. Georges became a courier, a messenger, and eventually a saboteur. His calm demeanor and local reputation made him the perfect cover. By day he fought fires. By night he passed coded messages, smuggled weapons, and helped coordinate intelligence between resistance cells. It wasn't heroism he sought, it was justice, but resistance work was never safe. Every act of defiance came with a cost, and the walls of secrecy grew thinner with each passing month. The Gestapo were ruthless, and betrayal was an ever-present shadow. Georges knew that capture was inevitable for many of them. Yet he continued. In October 1944, that shadow finally caught up with him. A betrayal, one whisper too many, led the Germans to a safe house in Belfort, where Georges and several comrades were planning a sabotage mission against a German supply train. At dawn, the soldiers surrounded the building. Gunfire erupted, echoing down the narrow streets. Georges and his companions fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Within minutes, it was over. The Germans stormed in, rifles raised. The survivors were dragged into trucks, beaten and blindfolded. For Georges, the fight wasn't over. It was only changing form. He was taken to a makeshift Gestapo interrogation center, where officers demanded names, routes, and codes. They wanted the heart of the resistance network, and they believed Georges could give it to them. But from the first question, Georges gave them nothing. At first, they tried reason, then threats, then pain. The interrogations went on for hours, then days. The beatings became routine. Sleep deprivation, starvation, humiliation, all designed to break his resolve. The Gestapo officers taunted him, telling him that resistance was hopeless, that France had already lost. But Georges Blind refused to answer. To his captors, this defiance was maddening. To his comrades, it was heroic. Georges wasn't just withholding information, he was protecting lives. Every second he stayed silent meant another resistance member could remain free. Every act of endurance was an act of victory. Yet even heroes are human. Alone in his cell, George felt the weight of exhaustion and pain pressing down on him. The bruises ached. His thoughts wandered to his family, to the comrades who might already have fallen, to the cause he'd sworn to protect. He knew the odds. He knew that if he didn't talk, he might never see the outside world again, but then something in him hardened. He had seen too much, helped too many, lost too many to surrender now. If his death could keep others alive, then that was a trade he was willing to make. One Gestapo officer, frustrated and unable to comprehend his defiance, shouted, "Why protect them? You're going to die anyway." George, bruised and barely standing, replied quietly, "Then I'll die as myself." That single sentence sealed his fate. The Gestapo realized he was a man they could not break. But rather than kill him immediately, they devised something crueler, a psychological torment designed to crush him from within. They would make him believe he was about to die, to watch fear devour his resolve. To watch fear devour his resolve. They called it a staged execution, a lesson for the resistance. On a gray October morning, Georges was dragged from his cell. His wrists were bound tightly behind his back, the coarse rope biting into his skin. He was led down a corridor lined with German soldiers, their eyes cold and expressionless. The heavy boots echoed off the concrete walls, a grim drumbeat that led to the courtyard. The air was sharp, the sky low and gray. Against the far wall, soldiers lined up, rifles loaded. A camera was prepared. The Germans documented everything, even their cruelty. As they positioned him against the wall, Georges straightened his back. He did not want to die slouched. He did not want to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. The officer barked orders in German. The rifles lifted. For a moment, the world was silent. And then Georges did something extraordinary, something no one there could have predicted. He looked directly at the firing squad, and with calm defiance, he smiled. That smile, small, unwavering, fearless, was more powerful than any weapon. It said what words could not: "You can take my life, but not my spirit." The Germans froze. The officer hesitated. This was not how prisoners behaved. They expected begging, tears, perhaps even a last prayer. But Georges gave them none of it. That single moment, captured forever in a photograph, became one of the most haunting and powerful symbols of the French resistance. The courtyard fell silent. The air was thick with tension, every soldier's finger hovering over the trigger. The officer gave the command in German, but his voice faltered mid-word. The squad hesitated, their rifles trembling slightly. The man they were about to shoot, this prisoner with hollow eyes and a broken body, was smiling at them. It wasn't the mocking grin of arrogance, nor the forced calm of a man in denial. It was something else, pure, unwavering defiance, a human soul declaring its freedom even as death stared it down. One of the younger German soldiers, no older than 20, lowered his rifle for a second. He looked uncertain, almost disturbed. The officer barked again, louder this time, trying to reassert control. But the moment had already shifted. The balance of power had changed. For the first time, the Germans realized that they had lost, not militarily but morally. They could command his body, but they could not touch his spirit. The cameras clicked. The officer's voice echoed off the walls. But there was no gunfire. The rifles never discharged. The order to shoot was never given. Instead, the officer stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stared into Georges' calm, unflinching face. For a brief instant, even he seemed unsettled, confused by the absence of fear. Then, with a motion of his hand, he ordered the soldiers to stand down. Georges had passed their cruelest test. He was dragged back to his cell, still smiling faintly, his wrists bruised and raw. The soldiers murmured as he passed, some in disgust, others in disbelief. The execution had failed to achieve its purpose. It hadn't broken him. It had immortalized him. That night, Georges lay on the cold concrete floor, replaying the moment in his mind. The sound of rifles clicking, the chill in the air, the look of hesitation in the young soldier's eyes. It all came back in fragments. He had seen fear that day, but it hadn't been his own. It had been theirs. He didn't smile out of pride or bravado. He smiled because in that instant he felt free. Death no longer frightened him. The Germans could take his life, but they could not force him to betray what he believed in. That realization gave him strength, more strength than his captors could ever understand. In the days that followed, Georges' treatment grew harsher. The Gestapo officers, humiliated by their failure, turned to renewed cruelty. He was deprived of food, beaten until he could no longer stand, and left in freezing conditions. They wanted to erase the smirk that had humiliated them in front of their own men, but George remained unbroken. Even when his lips bled, the faint trace of that smile never fully vanished. The guards began whispering about him. Some called him Der lächelnde Franzose, the smiling Frenchman. The nickname spread quietly through the prison. For other inmates, his defiance became a spark of hope. If George could endure this, perhaps they could too. Weeks later, when George was transferred to Dachau, one of the most feared concentration camps in Germany, his reputation arrived before he did. Dachau was a place where names ceased to matter. Men were reduced to numbers, stripped of identity, starved, beaten, and worked to death. Yet George's spirit carried a power that transcended the camp walls. At Dachau, George saw horrors beyond imagination. Emaciated prisoners shuffling to work details, the sick left to die in corners, the stench of death lingering in the air. The cruelty was systematic, designed to destroy hope itself. But where others saw only despair, George found a reason to resist. His defiance became quieter now, not in open rebellion, but in the refusal to surrender his humanity. He helped others share scraps of bread, whispered encouragement when hope was fading, and reminded fellow prisoners that they were still men, not numbers. Survivors later recalled that George never raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. His calm presence carried weight. His quiet strength was contagious. Even in that place of death, the story of the smiling Frenchman spread like a legend. Some prisoners never knew his name, but they knew the story, that a man had stood before a German firing squad and smiled. That story became a talisman, passed between the dying as a reminder that courage still existed in the world. As the months dragged on, George's health began to fail. The beatings, the hunger, the relentless labor, each day took its toll. Yet, despite his frail body, his eyes remained clear. Those who saw him in his final days said that he never complained, never cursed his captors. His silence was not submission, it was defiance. By late 1944, the Allies were advancing across France. The Germans knew the war was slipping from their grasp. Camps like Dachau and Blechhammer, where George was later transferred, became more brutal as desperation set in. Orders came from above: work them harder, feed them less. It was in Blechhammer, amidst the soot and cold, that George's journey would finally end. Exhaustion and disease took what the Gestapo could not, the body of a man whose spirit had already conquered death months earlier. He died as he had lived, silent, unyielding, and unbroken. But his story did not end there. The photograph of his defiant smile, taken that day in the courtyard of Belfort, survived the war. It would go on to inspire millions. To the world, it became a symbol of resistance. To the French, it became a reminder that courage was not measured by victory, but by integrity in the face of defeat. Georges Blind's smile had outlived the men who once pointed rifles at him. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a continent scarred by grief and loss. Cities lay in ruins, families were broken, and entire nations struggled to rediscover their identity after years under tyranny. Yet amid the ashes of destruction, some stories survived, not just in books or official records, but in whispers, in photographs, and in memories that refused to fade. One of those stories was about a man named Georges Blind, and the day he smiled at death. The image of Georges' final defiance, the moment he looked into the eyes of a German firing squad and smiled, was quietly passed among those who survived the war. The photograph had been taken by the Germans themselves, intended as a record of their power. But after the war, it became something far greater, a symbol of their failure to crush the human spirit. In post-war France, the picture began to circulate through newspapers and veterans' associations. People who had lost fathers, sons, and brothers in the war found something in Georges' face that spoke to them. That faint grin, calm, fearless, unbroken, became an image of everything the resistance had stood for. It wasn't just a picture of a man. It was a portrait of defiance. For the people of Belfort, Georges' hometown, his story hit especially close to home. Those who remembered him before the war recalled not a soldier, but a neighbor, a man who risked his life to save others long before he ever joined the resistance. His colleagues from the fire brigade spoke of his quiet strength, his sense of duty, and his calm in the face of danger. He never raised his voice, one of them said years later. He simply did what needed to be done, and in a way that was the essence of George Blind. His heroism was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, steadfast, and deeply human. When the details of his arrest, torture, and mock execution became public, the story resonated far beyond France. Allied veterans in America and Britain heard about the Frenchman who refused to betray his comrades even when staring death in the face. His defiance became an example of the kind of moral courage that had carried the world through the war. Historians and journalists began to write about him, framing his story as more than just an act of resistance. It was an act of faith. Faith that truth and loyalty were stronger than fear. Faith that dignity could still exist in the darkest corners of human cruelty. As France rebuilt itself from the ruins of occupation, the spirit of the resistance became the foundation of its national pride. In schools and memorials, teachers and veterans told the story of George Blind not as a tale of death, but as a lesson in integrity. Children learned that true courage wasn't about strength or weapons. It was about character. One post-war article described him as a man who smiled for France, while another called his image the smile that shamed tyranny. These phrases began to echo across Europe, appearing in publications and commemorations of resistance heroes. Even decades later, people would look at the photograph and feel the same chill, the kind that comes from witnessing something profoundly human and profoundly unbreakable. But George's influence went even further than remembrance. His smile inspired others to act, to rebuild, and to resist oppression in all its forms. In the years that followed, freedom movements across the world, from Eastern Europe to Latin America, would sometimes invoke his name and image as a reminder of what defiance looked like. One story tells of a group of young French students in the 1960s who carried a copy of George's photograph during protests, saying, "If he could smile at death, we can face anything." His image had transcended its moment in time. It had become a language of courage spoken across generations, even among those who had never heard his name. The photograph spoke for itself. The grainy black and white frame, the wall behind him, the rifles aimed, and that calm, inexplicable smile. It didn't need translation. It told a universal truth, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. In Belfort, a small plaque was eventually placed in his honor. It read simply, "George Blind, 1917-1944, firefighter, resistance fighter, died for France." The words were plain, but for those who knew the story, they carried immeasurable weight. Every year, local firefighters would pause to honor his memory, laying flowers beneath his name. Veterans of the resistance would recount his story to younger generations, ensuring that the man behind the smile would never be forgotten. His story also found its way into documentaries and war museums. At the Museum of the Resistance and Deportation, the photograph of George Blind became one of the most visited exhibits. People would stand before it in silence, often for minutes at a time, absorbing the sheer power of that moment frozen in time. George Blind had never sought fame. He hadn't lived to see his image become immortal. But perhaps that was part of what made his story so enduring. His courage was pure, not performed, not strategic, but instinctive. It came from a place of conviction that no oppressor could reach. He wasn't smiling for the cameras or even for his captors. He was smiling for something greater, for freedom, for loyalty, for the belief that even when darkness covers the world, a single act of courage can light the way forward. In a century defined by conflict, George Blind's smile became a mirror reflecting the best of what humanity can be. Fearless, principled, and profoundly alive even in the face of death. Time has a way of fading even the greatest heroes into the background of history. Wars end, borders shift, and the names of the fallen often blur into statistics and memorials. But some stories refuse to vanish. Some moments are so profoundly human that they echo across generations. The story of George Blind, the French firefighter who smiled in the face of death, is one of those moments. More than 80 years have passed since that day in 1944, when Georges stood before the German firing squad. The photograph of his final defiance, his calm grin surrounded by rifles, still stands as one of the most powerful images of World War II. But its true power lies not in the photograph itself, but in what it represents, the unbreakable will of the human spirit. In post-war France, George Blind became part of a new national mythology, a story told to remind people of what courage truly means. The French resistance had produced many heroes, but George's story stood apart because it captured a rare purity of defiance. It wasn't about strategy or military success. It was about moral victory. A man alone, unarmed, facing death and smiling. As the decades passed, historians, educators, and artists found new meaning in that act. His smile became a metaphor for spiritual resistance, a quiet but powerful rebellion that transcends the battlefield. In exhibitions, books, and documentaries, Georges' name was often mentioned alongside figures like Jean Moulin and Lucie Aubrac, symbols of unwavering loyalty and courage under occupation. But unlike many others, Georges didn't lead armies or coordinate vast networks. His strength lay in a single gesture that captured the entire essence of resistance. Across Europe, the story of Georges Blind spread beyond France's borders. In Poland, the Netherlands, and Norway, nations that had endured their own occupations, his defiance was recognized as universal. Survivors of Nazi camps saw themselves reflected in his smile. They understood what it meant to be stripped of everything yet still hold on to one's dignity. In Germany itself, the photograph took on a different meaning. For younger generations born after the war, George's image became a haunting reminder of what their grandparents' generation had witnessed, and what moral courage looked like on the other side of history. It became a moment of reflection, of reckoning, and of reconciliation. By the 1970s, George Blind's story was included in history curriculums across parts of Europe. Students learned that resistance was not only a military act but also a moral one. Teachers would show the photograph and ask, "What do you see in this man's face?" The answers varied: bravery, peace, defiance, faith, but they all led to one truth. George Blind represented the kind of courage that no regime could crush. In modern times, his story continues to inspire people far beyond the context of World War II. Activists, artists, and writers often reference George Blind as an example of moral clarity, the ability to stand firm in one's beliefs no matter the threat. His act of courage has been invoked in speeches about human rights, freedom of expression, and resistance against tyranny. In 2014, on the 70th anniversary of his death, the city of Belfort unveiled a new memorial honoring George Blind and other local resistance fighters. During the ceremony, a firefighter placed a single rose beneath his name, and the crowd stood in silence. Among them were veterans, students, and descendants of resistance members, all drawn together by a story that had outlived its time. The mayor of Belfort, in his address, said something that captured the essence of Georges' legacy. The Germans took his freedom, his comfort, and his life, but they could not take his smile. That smile belongs to humanity. What makes George Blind's story endure is that it doesn't rely on grand speeches or dramatic victories. It speaks through simplicity. His strength came not from weapons or rank, but from conviction, the belief that loyalty and honor were worth more than life itself. In that way, George belongs not just to France, but to the entire world. His defiance is echoed today wherever people stand against oppression, speak truth to power, or refuse to surrender their dignity. Whether it's journalists facing imprisonment, civilians resisting occupation, or ordinary people standing up for what's right, George's story reminds us that even the smallest act of courage can echo louder than fear. In today's world, where moral compromises often come easily, and truth is sometimes blurred by convenience, George Blind's quiet smile is a challenge. It asks us to consider, what would we do in his place? Could we still stand, still smile when faced with absolute terror? His story forces us to confront the boundaries of our own strength. Decades after his death, Georges' image remains one of the most powerful symbols of the Second World War. Historians describe it as the moment the oppressed defeated the oppressor without a single shot fired. That photograph, once meant to humiliate, became a triumph of the human soul. In museums, classrooms, and memorial halls, his story continues to be told, not because he was a soldier, but because he was an ordinary man who did something extraordinary. His courage didn't come from hatred or revenge. It came from integrity and love for his comrades and his country. When people look at George Blein's smile today, they don't just see a man facing a firing squad. They see what humanity can be at its best, calm in chaos, fearless in despair, and unwavering in faith. George Blein died in 1944, but his spirit never did. His name is etched not only on memorial stones but in the hearts of all who believe that courage is greater than fear. His story stands as a timeless reminder that even when the world is at its darkest, one act of defiance, one smile, can light the way for generations, because sometimes resistance doesn't shout. Sometimes resistance smiles. George Blein's story is not just history, it's a mirror held up to our own courage. He was an ordinary man who did something extraordinary. He stood before death, looked tyranny in the eyes, and smiled. That smile wasn't just defiance, it was faith. Faith in freedom, in loyalty, and in the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Today, his story asks us a question that echoes through time. When fear stands before us, will we have the courage to smile back? George Blein's final act wasn't about victory or revenge. It was about dignity, the kind of dignity that no enemy, no prison, and no rifle can take away. His courage reminds us that the greatest acts of heroism often happen in silence, in stillness, in the moment when a single choice defines a lifetime. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor George's memory, not just by remembering his name, but by carrying his message forward. Because courage like his isn't meant to fade. It's meant to inspire. So if you believe stories like this must never be forgotten, like this video, share it with others who value history and the power of resilience, and subscribe to our channel for more true tales of bravery, sacrifice, and the unshakable human will. And tell us in the comments, what does George Blein's smile mean to you? Would you have the courage to face fear with the same calm defiance? Because heroes like George remind us that even when everything is taken away, the human spirit still smiles.